All right. So welcome again to another of Pillars of Peace's last two Tuesdays webinar series. Tonight we're talking about the full spectrum of relationships from healthy to unhealthy and unsafe, all the way up to abusive relationships. And if you're not familiar with Pillars of Peace, we are an organization that is devoted to providing culturally and linguistically sensitive support to survivors of gender-based violence who are coming from Muslim communities. So anybody who is a survivor is eligible for our services, but the organization is structured in a way to ensure that this is a place where survivors from Muslim communities can be understood, and if they have specific language needs, that they can also receive those in language. So I am Jessamy Rahman Clapper. I'm the director of programs and also a licensed therapist. So I provide counseling in English, French, and Arabic. And Tamanna, who's here tonight, is our case manager. And if you want to
Hi.
go.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
So she's able to provide case management. That means, support, help figuring out resources, connecting to and navigating systems in the city for survivors in English as well as Bangla. So if you ever happen to call our helpline or write to our help email address, the first person you speak to is very likely going to be either Tamanna or our other case manager, Adine, who you'll meet on some of our future webinars, or if you come to any of our future events. And on that subject, we do have a couple of events coming up. We are every other Friday, including this coming Friday, for the next for 4 workshops. We're going to be at the African Services Committee in Harlem, providing additional workshops and information on similar topics that have to deal with relationship health, emotional health, mental health, as part of a series that African Services Committee is providing on women's health overall. And so if you'd like to meet us in person and talk about some of these topics in a more live space instead of a virtual space, then please visit our social media, and you can see the dates, times, and locations for all of those events. And finally, we also are offering a support group, which is for young adults who grew up with DV in their family of origin. We noticed that this is an area that's a little bit underserved, but there's a huge impact on people, especially as you're trying to navigate adulthood and adult relationships, if you've grown up with these kind of dynamics in your family at home. And so we wanted to offer this support to the community broadly. So as with any of our counseling services, it's anybody in New York State is eligible. That's just a licensing restriction that we have. But you don't have to be in New York City. You could be located elsewhere in New York State. And we hope that you will reach out to us as well if that's something that interests you. Now we can get on to the meat of the presentation.
Okay. So just an overview of how the presentation is going to go. So we're talking about a spectrum of healthy relationships all the way to every kind of unhealthy relationship. So the first thing that we'll be talking about is just generically how healthy relationships might look and some key elements of healthy relationships. And then we'll talk about unhealthy relationships and then unsafe relationships. And we kind of generally categorize them, but it is a spectrum. So you fall somewhere in this spectrum. And then we'll have time for discussion and a Q&A. Okay, so in healthy relationships, there is these key elements of mutuality, respect, support, collaboration, and responsibility. And with these elements, there's a lot of variation. Most of the time, you'll see like there's no one kind of perfect healthy relationship. A spectrum means that everything is connected, and it's possible um that sorry. Okay. They can be really varied, and it can be on a spectrum of affection, things like that. It really mainly means that the partners are in sync with each other. Um, so do we want to give time to answer these questions?
Yeah, so
Okay.
one of the reasons why we're talking about the full spectrum and range of how relationships can be is that variation is possible. And a relationship that starts out as healthy can change over time. Sometimes it might have periods where it becomes unhealthy. And if the partners are able to work together, they may be able to bring it back to a healthy place again. But we wanted to open this question up to the group to think about how might a healthy relationship become unhealthy? Like, how might that happen? And then vice versa, what about an unhealthy relationship becoming healthy or moving toward a healthier place? If anyone would like to share their thoughts on those questions, you can enter in the chat, or feel free also to raise your hand or unmute yourself. We're a small group, so you can just unmute yourself if you'd like to contribute.
I don't mind going first. So, one way that a healthy relationship might become unhealthy is that communication might start to fade over time. And, you know, uh, I'm thinking like either ignoring the other partner and kind of just like doing your own thing, or starting to become irritable and starting to yell at each other and just having very poor communication skills. And then in the same vein, going from unhealthy to healthy, maybe these two individuals can recognize what's happening and decide together that they need to take action. And whether that be that they actively work on it, alone, like just the two of them, or they involve a counselor or like a therapist to help them work through these communication skills and get them into a better place.
Thank you, Kiara. I want to ask a follow-up question because you talked about like the kind of shift that you might see happening when a relationship goes from healthy to unhealthy. But can you think of what would make communication in a relationship become worse if it had previously been good? Then you can anyone can answer this. It doesn't have to be you, Kiara, but what would make that change? Why would a couple who previously communicated in a healthy manner change how they're communicating?
Yeah, I don't mind elaborating. So it could be outside stressors. So it could just be, work might be really stressful at this time. If one partner is working in a stressful field, or maybe, outside environmental impacts. So for example, like the pandemic, when that hit, there were a lot of issues between relationships because you're kind of cooped up all day long with each other in the household, maybe get a little sick of each other from not having any space, or maybe family issues. Family members might say something to one partner, they might not like it. The partner might, support their family and not their spouse, and that can become, or their partner, that can become difficult. Yeah, those are just a few. There are many.
No, you came up with great examples, and that was what I was really looking for, is that oftentimes that shift is going to happen when there's some kind of increased stress on the relationship. And the flip side of that too is that sometimes we may be able to have a healthy relationship or a healthy partnership with someone else, but we haven't yet figured out like the coping skills that we need for a higher level of stress. And then when we confront that higher level of stress, whether that is a pandemic or a new baby or work stress or unemployment, the relationship might suffer because we're then having to figure out how to navigate a new set of circumstances, that, and maybe that's when we stop, kind of focusing on the partner, or we stop focusing on the relationship, or we stop using those healthy coping skills that do take more effort and more energy than kind of just falling back on what are sometimes our instinctive coping mechanisms, like withdrawing or arguing or moving into conflict. So I think we can move on to the next slide at this point and get into the meat of most of this presentation. Sadly, we are going to be talking about unhealthy relationship types, because there's a lot more categories under that umbrella than under healthy relationships.
Okay, so our division of like the unhealthy relationships are unhealthy and then unsafe. So first we're going to be talking about unhealthy. There's two categories under here, which is disengaged relationships and high conflict relationships, which we'll go into in the next slide. But even though the moment that a relationship goes from unhealthy to unsafe might not be a stark difference, it's just farther into this spectrum of unhealthy relationships. And so like we say here, like there's red lines that turn it almost like into an unsafe relationship. And yeah.
Or another way to think about it too is that a relationship that is unhealthy can remain safe or relatively safe if both partners continue to have a mutual respect for one another's safety and concern for their safety, right? Like we might be having a really rough disagreement. I'm feeling really upset. My partner's feeling really upset. But if both of us are committed to being safe in the relationship, then we're unlikely to move into unsafe behaviors because of that conflict. But the minute that we move past that, that's when we end up in an unsafe place in the relationship. And we'll come back to that more when we get to those relationship types.
Okay, so the first category are disengaged relationships. Usually these don't have that much conflict and there's a lack of support and affection or intimacy from the partner. It usually is connected to not or getting your needs outside of your relationship. You don't really go to your partner for those things. And it might look functional, but partners aren't really intertwined with each other. And yeah, I mean, it's not, there's nothing that's going wrong with the actual physical safety or just safety in general, but it is unhealthy because there's no connection happening or it's very weak. And so how can this happen, or what might it look like between two partners?
Particularly considering that usually in order for a relationship to happen, there has to be some engagement at the beginning. So usually relationships are not starting off disengaged, but they arrive there somehow. So we can jump in here, but if you think of something later, always feel free to add it in the chat. We mentioned, for those of you who attended our conversation on attachment, when both partners are avoidant, like when both partners' default coping mechanism is to withdraw and retreat, it's really easy for the relationship to end up in a place of disengagement. Even when the stresses are relatively minor, the stress that they're responding to might even just be the stress of vulnerability in a new relationship. But there's other reasons that partners can end up disengaged from one another. Like Kiara had mentioned, stress on a relationship doesn't always lead to conflict. It can lead to disengagement, right? Like if partners are overwhelmed, they're dealing with intense responsibilities, they might focus less on their partnership and focus on just dealing with those other responsibilities. And that can cause them to have less of a connection with one another. And so we want to be clear that even though in this relationship, there's no violence, there's not even necessarily much conflict, it's still unhealthy because the relationship itself is there's nothing happening there. There's no connection. And so it's very easy for that relationship to end, or for something else to kind of disrupt it down the line. And so the next category that we want to talk about is high conflict. And this is not an official term. So you might see other places talk about high conflict relationships as relationships that are unsafe, but we're making the distinction of this is a relationship where there's a lot of conflict, but there's still a commitment to safety. And this is sort of the opposite of disengagement, right? Instead of each partner retreating and withdrawing into themselves, they're constantly critiquing and attacking the other partner in an attempt to resolve whatever the issue is. And the hallmark of a high conflict relationship is that they're not using good conflict resolution skills with one another. So even though there are conflicts happening all the time, they're very rarely resolved. There may be recurring conflicts over the same thing again and again. There's just poor communication around the disagreement. The partners often feel hurt and in distress. And even though there's so much conflict, you see different variations. Sometimes there's very little intimacy and affection because there's been so much contempt and hurtful words over time. But you may also see some of these relationships feel exciting or passionate, and they may have like very warm makeup periods. But the difference with a repair in a high conflict relationship and a healthy relationship repair after a conflict is that the trust is not reestablished. And so you will see that over time, the connection does get eroded in a high conflict relationship. Even though both partners are very heavily engaged with each other, it's primarily in a combative sense. And so we mention again the sort of attachment pairings that might result in a high conflict relationship, although it's not a guarantee. One is if both partners are anxious, so they're constantly wanting things to be resolved right away, but it's not necessarily that they're getting that resolution. They're just looking to address things as quickly as possible to soothe that anxiety. And the other classic pairing is the anxious avoidant pairing, which we discussed last week, where you are going to have the partners constantly seesawing between the two extremes, the anxious partner and the avoidant partner, and neither partner is feeling happy and connected in this relationship. So if you'd like to contribute, how can a couple get to be high conflict, and what might it look like? We'll give a few minutes to chime in here.
I'm thinking for how they get to that point. It could be social influences. So, maybe seeing kind of like replicating other friends' behaviors, maybe, or I'm actually, I feel like I'm not too familiar with examples of how people get to that stage. I think I'm just more familiar with what it kind of looks like, which is, consistently maybe like we walk in the door and somebody, your partner is already like yelling at you and taking out their day on you, and just kind of like being really snappy and yelling and this is like at a point where there's like no clear and good clear cut communication skills. Is that like, does that sound right?
That's definitely one of the ways that it can look. And I think one of the things to remember when it comes to like, how do you get here, is that it could start off as there's just one or two conflicts, but those are not resolved. And there's like simmering resentment around them. So then it becomes a kind of default thing for each partner in the relationship to kind of pick at the other one when something is wrong or they're feeling bad. And the other hallmark of it is that, the couples see, instead of seeing one another as like partners in trying to have a good relationship together, they kind of see the other person as the obstacle to having a good relationship. And you can arrive that way many different ways. Like you could arrive to that place because there are a lot of things that have been happening with this partner over time. And you can also arrive at that place because you grew up seeing people relate to each other like this in a relationship. Like you mentioned, like with friends or family members, that it was just normal for people to be bickering all the time. And we see this actually like in sort of popular culture, that there's a lot of like, there's almost this assumption that if you're in a long-term relationship or if you're in a marriage, that you're just going to be bickering a lot of the time. And everyone needs to be able to have conflicts and resolve them with their partner, but bickering is not having conflicts and resolving them. It's sort of picking at each other and almost entering into conflicts, assuming that nothing good is going to come out of it. You're just kind of proving yourself right by telling your partner whatever it is that you're unhappy about, and your partner getting defensive and you saying, see, I knew you were never going to take me seriously. Like this kind of thing where the pattern starts to just repeat itself no matter what the conflict is.
So, next we're going to be talking about unsafe relationships, and this is distinguished through the disregard for the safety of the other individual or of both partners of each other. Oftentimes, partners might both feel unsafe, even if they're in abusive relationships, where one is more threatening to the other. But the main difference between the two that we just talked about and this is that safety and regard for the other person's safety. And the two relationships that we'll be talking about are power struggle relationships and abusive. And like we were just talking about high conflict relationships, can any of you guys think of how a high conflict relationship might reach a lack of safety or disregard for safety?
So one thing that wanted to make a note of before moving on to the individual definitions here is that one of the things that a number of relationship counselors and therapists and theorists, but particularly if you're familiar with the Gottmans, who have come up with a lot of material on relationships and counseling and even attachment work, they talk about contempt as being one of the major kind of death signs of a relationship. Like if you reach a point where you and your partner or one of you has contempt for the other, then it's very hard to come back from that place. And contempt is also a place, if you are feeling contempt for your partner, you've lost compassion for them. And so it does happen that a relationship can be in a state of high conflict for a long time and then move toward contempt. And then there might not be that feeling of safety in that relationship. It might not always be that high conflict relationship, when it loses safety, immediately goes to physical violence, but it could end up in a place where those partners don't care how badly they hurt one another emotionally, or those partners are not caring for one another when it comes to their health or just the things that you need from a partner, particularly if you are cohabiting with that person. So we want to kind of acknowledge that there are a lot of places that you can end up being unsafe in a relationship that are not necessarily about physical violence or even about the power and control of abuse that we'll talk about at the end. But when that like regard for your partner's safety or your partner's regard for your safety is lost, that's when you've moved into the unsafe relationship area. So again, the difference between just a high conflict relationship and a power struggle relationship is that it's not just about being in conflict with one another at this point. It's literally a struggle for power. And it's not that the partners in these relationships are people who are somehow like power hungry. Like, it's not like it only happens in you know, high political families or royalty or something. It's literally the power of decision making within the relationship. And oftentimes the reason why a partner will start struggling, a pair of partners will be struggling over power, is because both of them have the kind of attachment wounds that make them feel unsafe unless they feel like they have the upper hand or they have the control. What is different about a power struggle relationship from an abusive relationship is that both partners will have power at different times. It's not necessarily that it's 50-50 all the time, or that it's a constant back and forth. But instead of it being that one partner is kind of holding most of the power and occasionally uses threats or violence or manipulation to maintain that power and keep the other person in their place, instead, each partner is kind of working and strategizing to get the power back constantly. Again, because of the kind of developmental trauma that usually leads to people behaving in these ways, those relationships might feel exciting or feel familiar because of that same, there's a lot of engagement. It's not necessarily a healthy connection that they're having, but they're engaging with each other constantly. Even though it's not an abusive relationship, it might still be or feel unsafe to leave that relationship because of how much conflict and struggle there is. And because there's a lack of regard for the other partner's safety, there can be physical violence in these relationships as well, because that can be part of the tactics, that everything is sort of on the table in the struggle to get back power from the other partner in the couple. And it's important to note that it can switch into an abusive relationship, usually if it's not going to be too long into the struggle, but if one partner, after struggling for a while, just establishes dominance and keeps it for a long period, then it can become an abusive relationship. But it's important to note that even when it's not an abusive relationship, people in these relationships who are dealing perhaps with physical violence or other forms of violence and threats as part of that wrestling over power, they may need the same supports and services to leave as somebody who is in an abusive relationship with that one partner controlling everything. And so, I mentioned developmental trauma. It's very common that a pairing of two disorganized partners could end up looking like this, because both of those individuals have a very low sense that they can trust the partner, and they have a very high sense of threat and lack of safety. And so both of them may be struggling to get that control in the relationship. So some of the questions I think we'll also attend to at the end. So I'm going to hold on responding to that one. But if you think of other things that you want to ask, feel free to type them into the chat. And if it relates to this slide, we'll address it right away. And if it relates down the line, then we'll address it then.
Should we move to the next slide?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so the major difference, as Destiny mentioned, between a power struggle relationship and an abusive relationship is that an abusive relationship is when one partner establishes and maintains power and control over the other. I wrote throughout the course of the relationship, but it might change into an abusive relationship over time. But it might start out that way. So this can look like making the decisions in finances or social situations, but it's really just throughout all areas of your relationship. The power dynamic might be subtle, where one partner is always being undermined or through emotional manipulation so that they can control the decisions of the other individual. We have some examples where let's say you have a partner that says they're making all the decisions because the other one makes bad ones, and that's undermining their way of thinking, but also just to maintain control over the decisions that are being made. And over time, it will look like most things in the relationships depend on the abuser's mood or needs or desires, where the victim has to accommodate for them and make arrangements around the desires of the abuser. But these subtle actions and tactics that an abuser uses can eventually become reinforced through physical violence, but it doesn't necessarily have to be physical in order for it to be abusive. There's many other forms of abuse other than physical that still qualify an individual to be in an abusive relationship, like verbal abuse, emotional, spiritual, technological. But the main connection between all of these actions is that the abusive partner is maintaining the power and control over the other partner. So sometimes, like when a victim is disagreeing or challenging an abuser, it can result in escalating, where the abuser might be more obvious with the abuse and control, but it might also be received where the abuser is more relaxed about the disagreement or challenge because they're gaslighting their victim. But the reason why we qualify abusive relationships to be unsafe or at the extreme end of the spectrum is that because an abuser is usually threatened by their loss of control during a disagreement, attempting to end the relationship might eventually be dangerous, even if there was never any physical violence before that.
Yeah. And the other thing that we want to mention about the presence or absence of physical violence or even of like overt threats is that sometimes what happens in an abusive relationship over time is that the victim gets so good at accommodating and strategizing around the abuser and sort of making their life small and difficult and more difficult and the abuser's life easier. It can appear peaceful, but the control, that element of control is still there. And the second that that person stops accommodating the abuser, there's going to be some kind of retaliation or punishment for it. So even when there's not like been an what the criminal justice world would call an incident for a period of months or years, it doesn't necessarily mean that the abuse has stopped, because the power and control may be very well established. And that victim knows that if they step out of line, the violence or the threats or whatever type of more escalated abuse is going to come right back. So we want to open up for a discussion again, and particularly we want to ask all of you here if you think that abusive relationships always meet the criteria for abuse from the very beginning. Like, given how we've defined an abusive relationship as one where one partner has established and maintains power and control over the other, do you think that abusive relationships start off being identifiably abusive? So we have one no, if anyone else wants to chime in.
No, I feel like I think somebody just put in the chat too that it's not always like it's not a very black and white thing. The relationship could start off really healthy. I mean, that was one of the first discussions that we had, that it can start off very healthy and then it can over time turn into an abusive or like a not healthy relationship and then abusive relationship. So things can change over time. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Kiara. I do want to say that it's somewhat less likely that a relationship can be truly healthy and then make it all the way over to abusive, just because one of the hallmarks of a healthy relationship is that regard for, not only the regard for safety, but it's the ability to cope with stress and conflict in a healthy manner together with your partner and being able to share power. So if it's truly healthy in the beginning, it's unlikely to arrive at the place of being abusive. However, it can appear to be more peaceful. It can appear even to, you might be with somebody who seems like they're going to be able to have a healthy relationship, like they are able to say that they agree with those values, but then when you run into the test of the various stresses that come up in life, that's usually when you're going to see that that person is not able to be healthy in a relationship. But it's very correct to say that most abusive relationships do not start off that way, except for cases where people are put into a forced marriage with somebody who's abusive, and there's no need for that person to kind of woo the other person or present themselves in a way that brings them in. Most of the time, the abuser has to do some work to establish the control in the beginning. So that's one of our reasons actually for talking about the spectrum of relationships, because we think that it's actually very important to be able to identify when things are not healthy earlier than just being able to tell when something has become abusive. And so kind of along those same lines, what is the danger in believing that abuse is the only legitimate reason to end a relationship or to end a marriage? Oh, Fatima, I think you're trying to speak, but it's not coming in clearly. Yeah, if maybe you can type in the chat if you wanted to answer, but if if anyone else also wants to say what might be the danger in believing that abuse is the only legitimate reason to end a relationship or to end a marriage. So you can always chime in a little later, but one of the big problems with treating abuse as the only legitimate reason to leave or end a relationship is that you're essentially waiting for things to get really bad before before you are leaving. And in fact, when you do that, you have already gone past, other types of unsafe relationships. So you've already been unsafe for a while. And until you finally are able to say that, okay, this relationship is abusive. Now it's okay for me to leave. But very often an abusive relationship, depending on how quickly the abuse progresses or begins, it's going to go through those other stages first. And so if people are able to recognize that not only is this relationship unhealthy, but my partner is not interested or willing or able to work with me on making it healthier, or not only is this relationship unhealthy, but it's now become unsafe. If we're able to recognize when it's not fruitful to continue in that relationship, when our partner is not able to work with us on making it healthier, then we're able to exit those relationships before things get really bad. Now, I say that, and there are tons of cases still where the abuse does come on very quickly. Oftentimes it would be suddenly after, moving in or making a big commitment. And so this is not to shame or criticize people who are not able to leave, or it doesn't seem like anything's wrong until abuse has started. But there are definitely also lots of other people who stay in relationships thinking that they don't have a good enough reason to leave when things are already really, really bad. And I see Ben has written, because happiness and fulfillment, alignment of values are also important, right? Like we're in relationships for a lot of reasons. We're in relationships because we want to feel connection with another human being. We want to support and be supported. We want to have love and be loved. And maybe we want to have a family together. And if our relationship is not accomplishing those things, and there's no hope of our relationship accomplishing those things, i.e., our partner is not interested or able to make that shift with us, then that relationship is also something that we need to have the ability to leave, because it can get worse. And being very unhappy or being unsupported by your partner is also something that's not, good over the long term, not only for your mental health, but for people who have families. Then that means, that's what the children are learning about families and about relationships. So it's really important to us to kind of open up that caring about the relationship health overall is like the number one thing that we can do to prevent getting to the point of abuse, and also making it really easy for people who do find that their relationship turns abusive to know right away that this is not okay, and they don't have to suffer. Because very often in a relationship, people also minimize how bad the bad things are because they care about that other person, or they care about, their relationship failing, quote unquote. And so it's very common for people who have been in an abusive relationship for a while to not realize until later that this is actually abuse. But if they had already felt that it was okay to leave or okay to question the relationship just because it was unhealthy or it was unsafe, they might have started exploring those resources earlier. So why else might it be important to understand other types of unhealthy relationships besides abusive relationships? So Mariama has said it helps us take the necessary steps before it becomes abusive. And Ben has said to maintain a less stressful and more emotionally secure life. I want to talk about sort of what the necessary steps are, not in detail, but it's helpful because in some of these unhealthy relationships, like we said, it is possible to become healthier again. But if we understand the risks, the sort of risks and the potential of each relationship, then we can make more informed decisions about what things we might try to make it better, when it's not fruitful, what to do next, how to look out for our safety, and at the same time, maybe work on our own ability to be healthy in relationship with somebody else. So like the disengaged relationship, there might be a lot of potential to become more engaged in that relationship if not only is one partner willing to be vulnerable and engage more, but the second partner is able to respond to that over time. So when we understand all these different types of unhealthy relationships, we both have the potential to keep ourselves and our loved ones safer from abuse. And we also have the potential to have more rewarding and better relationships when change is possible and when both partners are able and willing to work on the relationship together. So I think we can move now to just open questions. I know Fatima had asked earlier, what if one partner always feels okay with walking away from the relationship? So that sounds like it's the relationship has reached an unhealthy point. It may just be that that one partner has that one unhealthy coping mechanism that whenever something is wrong, they default to, I'm going to end the relationship, I'm going to leave. But obviously that's not a healthy place for the relationship to stay over time. So in that case, the partners would want to look at whether there are other coping mechanisms or methods that are available to that partner, if they can make a commitment to sticking in the relationship, but also the partner who's constantly being threatened to be walked out on needs to think about, how much of this are they able to tolerate and set some boundaries around that too, because that already is creating some kind of imbalance in the relationship. And depending on the context, this could be a number of different things, right? Like threatening to leave can be, or threatening to abandon the partner can be a tactic used under abuse, but it can also happen if one partner skews more towards avoidant and disengagement. Or it can just happen in a high conflict relationship where that person really is, considering leaving because the relationship has gotten so distressing. So, as with many relationships that are about as with many questions that are about specific relationship questions, we really encourage you to reach out to us at Pillars of Peace. Use the helpline, use the help email address, and connect with us so that either you can access the free counseling if you do live in New York State, or if not, you can still speak to one of our case managers about how to kind of think through what's happening and maybe access resources that are near to you if you happen to be outside of the state. And Mariama has asked, how can one be more involved in the organization? Do you have volunteering opportunities or ways we could help? So we actually have a volunteer interest form. I can drop that into the chat momentarily. But because we don't at this moment have a lot of capacity to bring on direct service volunteers, you might not hear from us right away, but there are different kind of things that we do need help with. We particularly are putting out calls for some volunteers who are able to do more tech related things like website updates and so on. But please, if you're interested in volunteering at all, fill out this form so that you can tell us about your skills and your interests. And then as soon as we are able to bring on volunteers, we'll be reaching out to you depending on what your availability and your interests are. And to be more involved overall, definitely, keep following us on social media and check up on our website. We are also hiring in a couple of areas, so you might want to check whether those are relevant to you. I know as we move into Ramadan, we're going to be having more in-person events as well. So keep an eye out for those. We would love to meet you and interact with you then as well. Just give me a minute to find that link for you and drop it in. Right. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you being here and taking the time to think a little bit more in depth about relationships, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And, keep track of our helpline and email information so that you can reach out to us if you or somebody you know need some support around being a survivor of gender-based violence. And, we've talked a lot about domestic violence, but gender-based violence includes other things such as FGM, forced marriage, human trafficking. So, if you're in doubt, still reach out and, we can talk about what might be the best way to support you or the person that you care for. I'm going to stop the recording